My name is Margaret Hale, and I am 62 years old. For most of my adult life, I believed I had finally reached a place of peace, a small, steady home, a quiet neighborhood, and a marriage that had weathered illnesses, layoffs, and the usual storms of blended families. I worked as a school librarian for 37 years, and when I retired, I thought the rest of my life would be slower, softer, and uneventful. The kind of life where you water your plants in the morning and fall asleep to the same television shows every night. But tranquility has a fragile shell. Sometimes all it takes is one phone call to crack it wide open. I had always tried to be courteous toward my father-in-law, Charles. He was 80, proud, meticulously dressed, and as stubborn as a man forged in another century could be. He believed authority originated from age, not behavior. He believed financial decisions were a man's domain. And he believed, most alarmingly, that his family owed him obedience simply because he lived longer. Still, through the years, I stayed cordial. I checked on him, visited during holidays, and even drove him to his cardiology appointments when my husband, David, was busy. I interpreted his condescending remarks as generational quirks. I assumed his possessive tone around my husband was merely fatherly nostalgia. But there were clues, small, quiet disturbances that should have warned me that something was brewing behind the scenes. The first sign came a few months before everything unfolded. David and I had just downsized into a modest two-bedroom house, a little brick place with creaking floors, a charming garden, and a mortgage we were comfortable paying. For the first time in years, I felt the sweet lightness of financial stability. Then, unexpectedly, Charles began showing up more often. He asked questions so specific and oddly phrased that I found myself replaying them long after he had left. Questions like, does the bank still require both signatures for adjustments? Or, do you two plan to keep the loan in your names, or have you considered adding stability by involving family? I thought he meant emotional stability, perhaps a poetic reference to his desire to remain connected. But he wasn't being poetic. One afternoon, he asked for a complete tour of the house. Not in a casual way, more like a man inspecting a property he intended to purchase. He tapped the walls, studied the windows, frowned at the siding, and made a few grumbling remarks about resale value. When he left, I said to David quietly, "Your father seems awfully interested in our home." David brushed it off, saying, "He's lonely, Maggie. Let him feel involved." Maybe that was true. Or maybe I had been conditioned, after decades of trying to keep the peace, to look for the best explanation instead of the most likely one. Either way, the darkness wasn't on the horizon. It was already in motion. And the phone call that would expose everything was only a few days away. It happened on a Wednesday morning. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal, enjoying the quiet tap of rain against the window. The kettle whistled softly, and I was thinking about nothing at all when my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, but local. I answered casually. "Mrs. Margaret Hale?" a woman asked, crisp and polite. "Yes, speaking. This is Linda from Valley Horizon Bank. We received a request this morning regarding your mortgage and need verbal confirmation before processing." My stomach tightened. David and I never submitted anything recently. "I'm sorry," I said. "What request?" There was a small shuffle of papers on her end. "A modification request to add an additional party to your mortgage account. We need your authorization before we proceed." Her words felt thick and unreal. "Add, what? Who?" "A Mr. Charles Hale," she said. For a moment, silence expanded so completely that I could hear the refrigerator hum behind me. I managed to say, "You're telling me my father-in-law submitted a request to put his name on our mortgage?" "Yes. The form was filed this morning, and he indicated he had discussed the matter with you." I steadied my voice. "He absolutely did not discuss this with me. Please do not process anything." "Of course, Mrs. Hale. That's why we call before making official changes. We will freeze the request pending further instruction." When I hung up the phone, the kitchen looked different, like something had shifted in the air itself. My heart pounded with a slow, cold rhythm. Shock didn't come in a burst. It came in waves, each one harder, sharper, more humiliating. Why would he want his name on our mortgage? Why would he falsify my consent? And the heaviest question, did David know? When David came home that evening, his face softened when he saw me, unaware of the storm waiting behind my eyes. I asked him directly. No preamble. No small talk. Did you know your father tried to add his name to our mortgage? The color drained from his face so quickly I almost heard it leave. What? What do you mean? I replayed the bank call. Every word. David pressed his hands against the table, struggling to breathe steadily. Maggie. I swear I didn't know. He mentioned something a while ago about wanting to help us, but I told him we didn't need anything from him. That word, help, echoed oddly between us. Because what he had done wasn't help. It was intrusion. Control. A hostile claim on the home we built together. That night, I barely slept. I watched shadows move across the ceiling and replayed every recent interaction with Charles like a detective examining footage frame by frame. His questions. His interest. His comments about family stability. They weren't harmless musings. They were reconnaissance. But this was more than suspicion now. This was a boundary violated in the most personal way. And I intended to find out exactly why. I grew up in a family where boundaries were hard lessons learned late. My own father had been the kind of man who believed financial secrets were a virtue and emotional distance was discipline. My mother taught me caution by the way she walked on eggshells. So when I married into David's family, I recognized the familiar mechanics of control in his father long before either of us named it. Charles was a widower twice over, and both marriages had crumbled under the weight of his need to dominate every detail of the household. He dismissed opinions that weren't his own, disguised commands as advice, and could recite criticisms more easily than affection. But like many men of his generation, he used a charming exterior as camouflage. He wore tailored jackets, spoke in eloquent tones, and donated to charities when people were watching. He had that cultivated dignity that fooled strangers into thinking he was wise rather than manipulative. Still, underneath it all, he hated losing control, especially over David. David had once been his obedient son. But over the years, David grew into his own convictions. He worked diligently, built a life with me, and made decisions without seeking paternal approval. Our new home symbolized independence. A break from the gravitational pull of Charles's influence. So perhaps, in his mind, attaching himself to our mortgage was not just financial meddling. It was reclaiming authority he felt slipping away. There were hints long before this. 2 years earlier, during Thanksgiving dinner, he had said to me, "You know, Margaret, families function best when the patriarch steers the ship. Structure, direction, security. Younger generations forget that." I told him kindly but firmly, "I believe partnerships function best when everyone has a voice." He smiled faintly. Spoken like someone who thinks independence is a virtue. "It is," I said. His smile faded. After that evening, I noticed a coldness behind his polite nods. A subtle disapproval simmering beneath the surface. Now, looking back, I could see the pattern clearly. Every time David and I made a move that placed us further from his reach, Charles reacted with quiet sabotage dressed as concern. Still, the mortgage overstep wasn't just passive aggression or pride. It was something more calculated. I began examining the past 6 months with sharper clarity. He had started mentioning his financial legacy. He complained about not trusting certain relatives to handle his estate. He frequently lamented the complexities of aging. He hinted that he needed to ensure stability and continuity in the family line. But these weren't casual remarks. They were breadcrumbs. Pieces of a motive leading towards something deliberate. What I didn't know yet was how deeply his intentions ran, or what he was planning beyond the mortgage. But I was determined to find out. And once I started digging, I discovered the truth wasn't just unsettling. It was dangerous. I have never been the type to snoop through people's belongings or question motives without evidence. As a librarian, I learned that facts are more powerful than fear, and documentation is the backbone of the truth. So I approached the situation with precision, even though my emotions were tangled and raw. The first step was calling the bank again, this time requesting copies of the modification request. They were hesitant at first, but once I clarified that the request was fraudulent, they agreed. When the email arrived, I opened it with equal parts dread and determination. There it was, a scanned document, neatly filled out by hand. His handwriting. His signature. And 2 forged checkmarks indicating my verbal consent and spousal agreement. He had even written that I was fully aware and supportive of the financial plan. The audacity stunned me. But what chilled me further was the line he added under reason for modification. To secure the long-term stability of the property for generational ownership. Generational ownership. As if he believed our home should belong to him as much as it belonged to us. I printed the document and placed it in a folder labeled simply, "The Mortgage Incident." Next, I turned my attention to the strange comments he had made about his will and family legacy in recent months. I called David's older sister, Linda, who lived 3 states away. We weren't close, but she understood her father better than anyone. When I told her what happened, she didn't sound surprised. She sighed. "Dad's been talking about restructuring his estate. He wants to tie assets together so he can control them while he's alive. Real estate gives him leverage. He hinted that if he couldn't manage his own home anymore, he wanted a legal claim to yours." I felt my pulse quicken. Why? Because he believes that as long as he's financially entangled in his children's lives, none of us will abandon him. It was a cruel irony. He feared abandonment so deeply that he wielded control like a weapon to prevent it. But her next words hit even harder. "And Maggie, he's been telling certain relatives that your house might become part of his estate one day." I closed my eyes. He has no right to say that. I know. But he's rewriting reality to comfort himself. I thanked her and hung up, my resolve strengthening. I gathered everything, bank emails, printed forms, notes, dates, recollections. I documented every odd comment he'd made in recent months. I dug through our own financial files to ensure nothing else was tampered with. And then I checked something I hadn't considered before. Our mailbox. The following morning, I opened it and sifted through the usual coupons and bills. Then I saw it. A letter addressed to Charles Hale, delivered to our home. I opened it, my hands steady but my breath shallow. It was a pre-approval notice for refinancing. Refinancing our house. In his name. He had given our address to financial institutions. He had been planning this long before the bank called me. And worst of all, he wasn't finished. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a quiet invasion. He wasn't just overstepping. He was attempting to claim territory. My home. My marriage. My peace. And I wasn't going to let him take any of it, not 1 inch. But to stop him, I would have to confront him. With evidence. With truth. With unshakable calm. The kind of calm a woman earns after 62 years of surviving all the storms life can conjure. The days leading up to the confrontation were a slow, simmering build-up. I spent hours piecing together every detail so that when the moment came, I was prepared, not emotional, not reactive, but grounded in irrefutable truth. David agreed we needed to face his father together. But I could see the strain in his eyes. Children of controlling parents learn to shrink themselves to avoid conflict. I held his hand the night before and told him gently, "We're not attacking him. We're defending our home." He nodded, though his shoulders still tensed with the weight of old patterns. Before confronting Charles, I needed absolute clarity. So I called the bank once more and asked a direct question. Had the request been approved, what would it have changed legally? The representative answered matter-of-factly. It would have given Mr. Hale shared financial standing on the mortgage. Any refinancing, sale, or transfer of interest would require his signature. In other words, he would have held partial control of our home. Control he had not earned and did not deserve. I thanked her and hung up, my determination crystallizing. That night, I noticed something curious as I reviewed the mailbox again. Another letter addressed to him. Another financial solicitation. He had been using our address consistently. This was not impulsive behavior. It was premeditated. When David and I drove to his father's house the next day, the air felt heavy. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes everything look slightly off color, as though the world itself sensed the tension. Charles answered the door with his usual polished smile, greeting us as though nothing unusual had occurred. But when he saw the folder in my hands, the smile flickered. "Margaret, David, come in." We sat in his living room, surrounded by old photographs and books he never actually read. A grandfather clock ticked insistently in the background. I placed the folder on the coffee table but didn't open it yet. "Charles," I began calmly, "we received a call from the bank." His eyes narrowed a fraction. "About what?" "The request to add your name to our mortgage." His jaw clenched so subtly I almost missed it. "Well," he said with feigned innocence, "I was simply trying to help. I thought it would benefit you both to have extra security." I kept my voice steady. "Help requires consent." "It was implied," he said, shrugging. "We're family. These things don't always need forms and signatures." I opened the folder. The papers inside made a soft, deliberate rustle. "They do when you forge my consent." His face paled. David shifted, finally finding his voice. "Dad, this is serious." Charles waved a hand dismissively. "You're overreacting. I have every right to ensure the family's stability. One day, when I'm gone." I cut him off gently. "One day when you're gone, our home will belong to us, not your estate. Not your lawyers. Us." His composure cracked. And the truth began to spill out. He confessed that he feared being moved into a facility if his health declined. He worried that his home would be sold, leaving him without leverage. He believed attaching himself to our mortgage would ensure that we were bound to him. Those were his exact words. Bound. As if love were a chain. As if obligation were family. When he finished speaking, the room hung in heavy silence. And I realized then that his attempt wasn't just about power. It was about fear. But fear does not excuse manipulation. And fear does not grant the right to violate trust. He had crossed a line that could not remain uncrossed. And I was going to draw that boundary so clearly that even he could not twist it into something else. The confrontation was coming. And I intended to deliver it with truth sharp enough to cut through decades of entitlement. I took a long breath, the kind that settles the spine and clears the fog from the mind. Then I laid out every piece of evidence with meticulous calm. "Here is the form you submitted," I said, placing the bank document in front of him. He looked away. "Here," I continued, "is the pre-approval letter sent to our address, listing you as a potential applicant for refinancing our home." His hands tightened into fists on his knees. "And here," I said, sliding forward my printed emails, "is the bank's confirmation that your request would have given you legal control over any major decision regarding our mortgage." He finally snapped. "I wouldn't have abused it. I only wanted security." I kept my voice measured. "Security for yourself, not for us." David added, voice trembling but firm, "Dad, you went behind our backs. You forged my wife's consent. That's fraud." Charles scoffed. "Don't be dramatic." It was the dismissiveness that made David sit up straighter. For the first time in years, he looked his father in the eye without flinching. "This isn't drama. It's the truth. And you need to hear it." Charles's face contorted with indignation, but David pressed on. "You have manipulated us for years, guilt, pressure, superiority. But going after our home? That crosses a line I can't ignore." I watched the exchange quietly, letting David reclaim his own autonomy as I reclaimed mine. Then I leaned forward, speaking in a tone so steady it stilled the room. Charles, listen carefully, because I will only say this once. Our home is not your contingency plan. It is not your leverage. It is not your safety net. And it is not your possession. His mouth tightened. You used deception. You assumed ownership of decisions that were not yours. And you expected obedience because you fear losing control. He looked wounded, but I continued. I understand aging is frightening. I understand the desire for security. But control is not a substitute for connection. And manipulation is not love. For a moment, the room softened. Not because he changed, but because the truth finally echoed against a surface he couldn't deflect. David said quietly, we will help you when you need help. But you do not get to secure your future by jeopardizing ours. Finally, with a shaking hand, I slid the final paper across the table. A written statement from the bank confirming that the request had been frozen and flagged. A protective measure. Charles sank back, looking older than I'd ever seen him. So what now? He murmured. Now, I said, we establish boundaries. Clear. Firm. Uncompromising. No financial requests. No signatures. No paperwork of any kind without full, written consent from both of us. No using our address for applications. No inserting yourself into our legal affairs. He opened his mouth, but I continued. And if any of these boundaries are violated again, we will pursue full legal action. Including fraud charges. His eyes widened, not in anger this time, but awakening. He hadn't expected consequences. He certainly hadn't expected resolve. David stood, and I stood with him. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with clarity. And clarity is sometimes the sharpest blade. The aftermath unfolded slowly, like dominoes falling in deliberate sequence. First, I sent a formal letter to the bank confirming I had not authorized any modifications and requesting that our account be flagged against third-party changes. They complied immediately. Next, David called his sister and explained everything. She, in turn, contacted a few extended relatives, those who had been hearing exaggerated stories from Charles, and corrected the narrative. Word spread, and suddenly the whispers of Charles being unfairly excluded from our home evaporated. What replaced them was quiet understanding. Even sympathy. Then came the hardest part, reducing Charles's influence in our daily lives. David and I agreed that, for at least several months, we needed distance. Controlled contact only. Scheduled visits only. No unannounced drop-ins. No financial discussions of any kind. When we told him this, he resisted at first, accusing us of being ungrateful. But David remained firm, and I added calmly. Boundaries are not punishment. They are protection. Eventually, he relented, not gracefully, but necessarily. Meanwhile, the flagged account triggered additional protections. The bank required dual authentication for any changes, written confirmation for every request, and a password only David and I knew. Our home had become truly ours again. Then something unexpected happened. 2 weeks later, Linda called to tell us that Charles had visited his attorney and made significant changes to his estate plan. He's transferring his own house into a trust, she said. A living trust. One that ensures he can't lose it through panic or confusion. I think your confrontation forced him to face reality. It wasn't redemption. But it was responsibility. And that mattered. In the following months, Charles's behavior shifted. Not dramatically. Not like a man transformed. But like someone who had finally run into a wall he could not climb over, someone forced to reckon with the limits of his control. He apologized, in his own awkward, halting way. Not fully acknowledging everything. But enough to mark the beginning of change. He stopped asking intrusive questions about our finances. He accepted scheduled visits without complaint. He began relying on professional caregivers for tasks he once tried to co-opt from family. In short, the consequences led him toward healthier independence. And they led David and me toward a stronger, more united partnership. Our home became peaceful again. Not because the storm never existed, but because we had weathered it, and rebuilt the walls with intention. Now, months later, I sit on my back porch with a cup of tea, watching the late afternoon sunlight fall across the garden. The house feels warm again, the kind of warmth that comes not from insulation or weather, but from safety. From reclaimed space. I'm 62 years old, and life has taught me that betrayal doesn't always arrive as infidelity or violence or dramatic upheaval. Sometimes it comes disguised as concern. As family. As love. But love without respect is not love. And concern without consent is not care. If there is one thing I learned through this ordeal, it is this. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors. And you choose who walks through. Charles never intended to harm us, not consciously. But intention does not erase impact. And fear does not justify deception. What he attempted was a violation, of trust, of autonomy, of the sanctity of a home. But confronting him with truth, documentation, and calm strength allowed justice to unfold without cruelty. It allowed healing instead of bitterness. And it allowed a man terrified of losing control to finally face the truth: control is not connection. In the end, our marriage grew stronger. Our home remained ours. And our peace, once fractured, became more resilient than before. If you've ever faced someone who tried to intrude upon your life under the guise of help, I hope my story reminds you that you have the right to draw boundaries. You have the right to confront deception with truth. And you have the right to protect your home, both the physical one and the one inside your heart. Thank you for listening to my story. If you'd like to hear more true-to-life stories of justice, healing, and quiet revenge rooted in truth and dignity, make sure to engage with this channel. Your support helps these stories find the people who need them most. And remember, clarity is power. Boundaries are freedom. And truth is the quietest form of revenge.